This is San Francisco.
It's Toshio, and going to be talking to Andrew Szeto today on the podcast. Andrew's going to come and talk about Asian American organizing in the Bay and how representation is no stand-in for action. Welcome to San Francisco, chef, organizer, and future farmer of America, Andrew Szeto.
Thanks for having me.
So today we're going to be talking about Asian American organizing in the Bay. How did you start learning about this history that, until I met you, I was pretty much unaware of?
Yeah, I don't really know if there's like an origin story there. I know that my interest in all this probably came from campus student organizing when I was in college for ethnic studies. And I think there wasn't actually an ethnic studies program when I was in college, but kind of the drive for it, and then kind of the organizing work that I was involved in when I came back to San Francisco kind of led me back to wanting to learn more about Asian American studies. And the work that I was doing and you were doing around anti-eviction work, the kind of the moment that really defined the struggle for a lot of folks was the iHotel eviction campaign, which involved a lot of Asian American activists in the 70s when it happened, and contemporarily because the iHotel was rebuilt, and a lot of the organizing work that we were doing, like the event we put on, was held at the new iHotel. So there's kind of like an actual like physical space, literal space that allowed us to kind of reflect. And then for some of us, like me, I think like I kind of was really curious about what that struggle was like, and being from San Francisco too, and having watched that movie so many times, there was just a lot of history to learn, actually.
And you're speaking about the film, The Fall of the iHotel?
Yeah, which is a documentary they made, I think, in the 80s, early 80s. So it was a couple years afterwards, but a lot of the footage is while the iHotel was still around, because they demolished the building immediately following the eviction. So there was like a hole in the ground for like 25 years.
Right. And this becomes a huge moment, not just for Asian American organizing in the Bay, but it's international news. The International Hotel, evictions of all of these low income workers from the Philippines in what was at the time Manila town. It was then bulldozed, redeveloped, this part of downtown. Could you give a little rundown for people who are not familiar with the iHotel?
Yeah, the International Hotel, or what they called the iHotel for short, was a SRO on the corner of Jackson and Kearny Street, kind of on the edge of Chinatown, between the kind of encroaching financial district and Chinatown itself. So it was quite large, actually. I don't know how many rooms there were, but it took up a whole corner of the block. It was an SRO that housed primarily like senior Filipino men, Chinese men, and some families too. Some Black folks lived there too. And in 1969, kind of in the midst of redevelopment in San Francisco, they were served an eviction notice by the owner at the time, Walter Shorenstein, whose legacy lives on. If you look up his real estate holdings or the legacy of him, he owns quite a bit of downtown San Francisco. I mean, not him, but...
Yeah, you still see that name up around town on new luxury condos, usually around the construction, Shorenstein Realty.
And I think the Twitter building is a Shorenstein property. Anyway, so when he was alive, he had served them an eviction notice, and I think he had planned to build parking lots on the property so that all the suburban commuters and tourists would have somewhere to park in this kind of new redeveloped downtown space that was there. But as you know, 1969 was also a year of rebellion all over the country. And so mass movements kind of arose to support the eviction campaign, the anti-eviction campaign of the seniors, and it kind of galvanized a lot of different people from labor to Asian Americans and colleges to local community activists. And it was a 9-year struggle that went on till 1977. So they actually prevented the eviction for 9 years.
And this was before drones and drone footage, but there are photos from helicopters of these massive protests around the I Hotel in the late 1970s in what was part of this big area of downtown Manila town. The whole neighborhood was demolished by Shorenstein and the real estate industry with help from the urban planners of the time at City Hall, like Justin Herman, and riot cops who forcibly removed people from the building. Like you said, though, organizers were able to keep 200 tenants there from eviction for 9 years, which drained Shorenstein's wallet and caused them a lot of pain, undoubtedly. As Miss Major says, sometimes the best you can do is give the motherfuckers hell for what they do to us. The land where the I Hotel was demolished, that was empty until 2003, almost like it was cursed from what had happened there leading up to the evictions. But one material thing that eventually came out of the struggle, decades too late, of course, was low-income senior housing. So you do have people living at what is the I Hotel today. That said, the I Hotel is a symbol of the greater struggles around housing involving Asians at the time.
And I mean, yeah, the Bay Area was really one of the central hubs for Asian American organizing, a kind of what folks have called the Asian American movement. Not just Asian American people, but folks from all different ethnicities and races kind of were inspired by a lot of different global movements, like the anti-Vietnam War struggles, the communist victories in Cuba and China, especially. And a lot of folks in the Bay kind of turned to those radical Marxist-Leninist politics, communist politics, because they really did believe revolution was coming. And so there's different organizations that were formed, including Iwar Kun, Wei Min Shi. A lot of them were housed in the I Hotel, which is sort of what makes it a really unique struggle to think about and learn about, because it wasn't an anti-eviction struggle, but so many different community organizations made it their home. Kearney Street Workshop was in the basement, and those groups some are no longer, some do have legacies to organizations today, like Chinese Progressive Association still exist, and they were the community arm of one of those groups in Chinatown at the time. Yeah, not necessarily many like figureheads, I would say, from that time, but they live on. Like the people like Bill Soro, Al Robles, they were really kind of central leaders in the I Hotel struggle, and really supported the senior tenants in a kind of very day-to-day way, like made them food, talked to them, listened to their stories, really became friends with them. And then people like Yuri Kochiyama, who ended up moving to Oakland later in her life, kind of made Oakland her hub. And she was a really important figure for the Asian American movement, because she kind of is someone who really struggled very principally, supported prisoners throughout her life, opened her home for radical organizing spaces, was a part of all kinds of things, the movement for redress, supported labor worker struggles in New York. Yeah, there's a lot of different variations of like what is considered a radical history as well. There were also a lot of community organizations that were just doing service work that still exist, and they're not necessarily part of these radical legacies, like the Asian Law Caucus and others. They were around in the 70s, but they were just part of a general wave of community organizations that were formed, that were getting government money, grant money to do that kind of work. I think the radical history is actually something that is very distinct from those kind of liberal histories too.
Speaking of nonprofits, we had Dean Spade on the show a few weeks back, and we talked about the nonprofit industrial complex, and we talked about optics. Right now, we are in a time when optics and representation get so much weight in politics. For example, we have a mayor who's clearly interested in the optics of diversity, London Breed, who likes to say Black Lives Matter, but her actions tell a very different story. As protests started going off around the murder of Banko Brown, the Black trans 24-year-old who was killed by a Walgreens security guard, this murder that the city effectively sanctioned. As the protests began, the mayor got on a plane to Israel to go have these meetings with Zionists. But has the representation and optics of diversity, at least, always been part of politics in the Bay, at least going back to the 1970s?
Yeah, there's a kind of common trope, and I think in a lot of different struggles too, that certain groups of people like wake up, or like waking up. They're like a silent majority that's waking up and ready to speak their voices, and this has been really common kind of throughout the decades in Asian American history. Whether it was Vincent Chin in the 80s, there was supposed to be a watershed moment for Asian Americans to speak up against anti-Asian violence. And a lot of these narratives really do push a kind of liberal multiculturalism, and a lot of the ways that people frame relationship to systems, to politics, to power is one of inclusion, that our history is one of exclusion. Like literally the Exclusion Acts prevented Asian immigration for 50, 60, 70, 80 years. And now is our time to be full citizens in the American project. I think what's interesting to learn about when I was in the archives is that even before the 70s, a lot of these narratives existed, that there were always these dualities of liberalism and more conservative politics, even back then. Whether it was like in Chinatown, the benevolent society versus new push by younger folks to open up these community organizations, that don't necessarily mean that the liberals were the radicals either. The radical leftists at the time actually were really pushing back against these kind of inclusion politics because they believed in revolution, not just a liberal multicultural society. They talked about imperialism abroad and imperialism in America. They talked about capitalism. They talked about the actual systems that they were trying to change. And I think when people think of Asian American history, they do tend to think of the kind of ways that these big protest moments allowed for different kinds of inclusions into, I think these days people talk about mostly media, all the Asian people winning the Academy Awards and being able to make Hollywood movies, but they're not talking about the kind of the systems that, like Hollywood itself, they're not talking about what do we gain from being included into Hollywood or politics, or what, being the first elected this or that. Like what is the kind of purpose for it? And I think a lot of the radicals at the time actually, called out the Asian cops in Chinatown. They didn't want more Asian cops. They didn't, they called them kind of sellouts or Asian politicians because they were folks who were running for office in the 70s too. There's always been a kind of more radical critique of liberal politics. I don't think people are able to really like differentiate that though.
And so you have things like Stop Asian Hate, for example, where people aren't thinking with too much nuance around that.
So like there's a kind of like way that people frame to give the Stop Asian Hate stuff. There's always going to be these kinds of like binary thinking, I guess, that there's either liberal or conservative like responses to Stop Asian Hate, and not like a more radical like abolitionist approach that can exist. So like the conservatives do weaponize the Stop Asian Hate to further policing and criminalization. And when they use these kind of same liberal histories of exclusion and injustice in the community to make those claims too. And at the same time, I think liberals are also the ones that help push the same narrative of Stop Asian Hate, like the data tracking ticker that a lot of sites cited, or what news outlets cited, was started by a professor at San Francisco State. A lot of these things are actually the same to me. Even in kind of mainstream liberal media, I think people conflate uh, kind of liberal approaches, or liberal like movements to more radical ones, and they're not.
Yeah. And you collect some of these histories and ideas into a beautiful new zine. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I made a zine for this current exhibition that's being put on at the San Francisco Main Library right now, called Dreaming People's History. It's a collaboration between the library and Kearney Street Workshop, and it's an exhibition kind of dealing with the archives of Kearney Street Workshop itself, but also how contemporary activists and artists and kind of engage with history that isn't just nostalgic, kind of looking to the past, but to kind of engage with the past in a way that helps us understand the present. So the zine I wrote was about the histories of Asian American abolitionist struggles, or at least prison struggles, that I was learning about a lot while I was in doing a lot of archival research for my master's degree in ethnic studies. I just kept encountering things that I started to collect ephemera, and started to read all these articles and tried to learn more, because there wasn't really that much out there about that. I tried to kind of piece together the things that really like have influenced me and continue to influence me. One of them is a photograph I found when I was archiving stuff at Critical Resistance's office in Oakland, from their original, or their first conference they did in 1998, Beyond the Prison Industrial Complex, Critical Resistance. It was just kind of a group picture of a bunch of Asian people holding a banner that said Asians for Jericho. And the banner is a picture of a dragon. And on the bottom is a line from a Ho Chi Minh poem about when the dragon is freed, kind of thing. And at the corner is a bunch of names of people who I guess were part of sending the greeting. And when I saw the picture, I'd never seen anything. I hadn't seen that picture before, first of all. But a lot of the names on the picture were actually really unfamiliar. Um, Yuri Kochiyama signed it, but she's pretty well known. And so that image just kind of stayed with me, and has kind of like sparked this more research that I've been wanting to do about Asian American participation in different abolitionist struggles. It's just really like cool to see that there's actual like evidence. And so like, I like started to research the people, the names of them. Michael Yasutake is someone who I learned about because I found his name there, and he was a pastor in Chicago that formed the Interfaith Prisoners of Conscience, which was an organization that supported political prisoners in the 80s, and really fought for them to get recognized as political prisoners in the U.S., which the U.S. doesn't say that they have any. And a lot of those political prisoners were activists and people who were fighting for national liberation struggles, so like Puerto Rican independence struggles, Black Liberation Army political prisoners, Black Panther political prisoners, white anti-imperialists that were were doing stuff in solidarity with those movements. So a lot of them were locked up for a really long time, and a lot of them are just getting out in the last 5 years. So there's kind of a connection to the present too, because those were the same people who up until very, very recently were actually still incarcerated for their participation in very radical movements. So that's one thing that kind of stuck out to me, and I wanted to kind of like memorialize in the cover.
Yeah, I appreciate you for exposing me to the lineage of some of these liberation struggles that will not appear in corporate media and won't appear in high school textbooks because they are struggles that still threaten people in power. And those people in power have not figured out a way yet to co-opt these struggles. And your writing ties together protest actions from the 1970s to very recent ones. So on a more recent note, you write about being arrested with the No New Jail Coalition.
Yeah, so when I was writing the zine, I was trying to figure out how to write something not so straightforward as far as a history goes. And I was trying to think of moments in my own life where I was participating in these things as well. And recently I've been wanting to kind of do documentation about it in my own way at least. And so I start off the zine writing about one of the kind of pivotal moments in the early period of this campaign to stop a new jail in San Francisco. I think this was back in 2014, 2015. And so I write about kind of a group of us who volunteered to risk arrest and to disrupt the Board of Supervisors vote on accepting $80 million from the state to build this new jail, which was to replace the Hall of Justice at 850 Bryant. It was seismically unsafe and decrepit and full of abuse, human rights abuses by the sheriffs as well, who patrol the jails. Yeah, it kind of takes the reader into the scene of that vote. We ended up stopping the vote. We didn't know what was going to happen, and surprisingly, actually, we all ended up in jail, which doesn't normally happen. I thought when we volunteered to get arrested, normally they just kind of take you to the back. You're in zip ties, and then you get let go out the back door with the little sheet to go to court or something. But we ended up actually spending a long time getting our locks cut off, and then eventually they took us all to 850 Bryant. And one thing that I learned actually when I was trying to kind of remember that moment was that when we were in jail, actually, Mario Woods was killed in the city. And that next week, really, of a lot of street protest. This was also kind of the Ferguson era. And so people were really, really ready to get out on the streets and do something. And Mario Woods kind of became this symbol in some ways in San Francisco for the kind of generalized policing and the violence of policing that was happening nationally. And then actually, I think it was a week or two later when the vote did happen, the supervisors unanimously rejected the money. So we actually won that fight.
Right. And as a result of the organizing, the sheriff did not get millions of dollars to build a new jail, a moment more people need to know about. And it is described in the zine. Zines are something I was obsessed with in the 1990s. I spent a lot of time at Tower Records in the magazine section, and I'd write columns for this punk zine out of St. Louis. But why make a zine in 2023?
Why make a zine? I think I'm trying to, preserve the culture. The DIY spirit, I think, is something that's really been lost on a lot of people. I think like it's part of this kind of the neoliberal entrepreneurial push for so many people to just monetize themselves, or their kind of interest into things or experiences or personas online, that it's really hard to kind of have a analog connection, and not just like digital versus analog, but kind of genuine connections. And I feel like my my thoughts lately have been along those lines where I cook now for a living, and so like in order for someone who likes cooking to kind of pursue that as their passion, a lot of times they're they get told that they should do a pop-up or they should make this product and sell it. And I think part of the DIY spirit is that, it's not about monetization. It's about kind of creating things for making art and just sharing them with the people that you want to share them with, and not necessarily having it be sold. What zines are cool is that, at least to me, the spirit of a zine isn't that they should be $10 and um, it's only sold by MFA art students who have a bunch of free time to make them, but that you can scam photocopies from your office and just distribute them and kind of find the readers that you're probably more likely trying to find, rather than through turning it into a commodity. No one ever like really engaging with your work in that way. With this scene in particular, I think I've been really into like reading memoirs lately for some reason, and I think it's actually really interesting to read about how people narrate kind of important moments in their life as far as reflecting goes. And I feel like there's not a lot of actual first person or personalized narratives that people in social movements contribute to literature, to writing, or whatever. Maybe I guess in documentary, but in like film, but not necessarily in writing. And it would be really cool just for more people to share their own experiences about what brought them in to movement spaces and why they do the things they do. And I think zines are really cool because you're not writing for the New York Times audience. You're writing for your friends and your community first and foremost.
Right. It's a personal format, and so you're naturally more intentional with it, I think, than things you might, for example, post on social media, because there's the physical aspect of it, which means you actually have to make the copies. How can people pick it up, though?
What's cool about the zine actually is it is part of an exhibition. You can get it for free at the San Francisco Main Library and the downstairs Jewett Gallery, on display for the next couple months until August. And there's a table that you'll see the zine on that has a bunch of other kind of ephemera from the period, because I also really wanted folks to be able to engage with the actual archive. And so there's printed reproductions of a newspaper that I was reading that's from the 70s, where I learned about all of the stuff that's in the zine actually, that people can actually take. And so the zines are actually on the table too for free. So it's not just on a wall. You can actually take one home.
I would love to hear more Asian American radical organizing stories, the kind you put in this zine, which is titled Heartbeat of Struggle. I hope you make more of them. I love the memoirs we have from people like Asada Shakur, Yuri Kochiyama, James Baldwin's memoirs, and the autobiography of Angela Davis. I have thought about the question of why we don't have as many memoirs of radicals. Like, I think about how Miss Major had to be convinced to do a memoir and the documentary about her life, or Linda Evans, who finally said yes to being interviewed for this podcast. Linda was famously imprisoned for being part of the Weather Underground, and while she was in prison, wrote this really important piece called The Prison Industrial Complex and the Global Economy that helped define the concept of the prison industrial complex. But Linda and Miss Major and other people who started out in radical collective organizing, I get why they are hesitant to make themselves the center of a story, because the collective aspect is so core to what they do. The tradition of organizing they came from, you don't center the individual, which is obviously very different from a lot of today's media, where the media we consume is hyper individualized. But I do think that sometimes it's helpful to know how someone who has been struggling for way longer than you managed to do something or kept going and didn't burn out. And sometimes the individual stories are just interesting.
Yeah, there's like a lot of interesting stories that no one's ever gonna know. And well, the problem with that line of thinking too is that there are going to be stories told, and so there's not going to be a whole lot of nuance because of that. I felt the same way. Like, and I think writing this was to say like I don't like just give myself to these organizations. I have my own humanity too. And that's what's actually fascinating to me is that like what drives a lot of individuals to be part of these collective struggles. And the I Hotel book is basically a memoir of Estella Habal, San Francisco's International Hotel. I learned so much from that because there's a whole chapter. One of my favorite chapters in that book actually is like she talks about her time in these communist groups and how like there was so much infighting and like but also how much she gave to the org and like there's a lot of like regret because like a lot of people like weren't allowed like literally weren't allowed to like have families like have kids. They're like no you can't because you have to be involved in this organization like 24/7. And so she's like, oh, wow, that was such an awful way to live. Why did I agree to do that? In a political sense, like they call it democratic centralism. So like you had all these leaders basically telling the cadre, like, this is what you got to do. So like if you were in these radical cadre, you just follow the line. Well, I think most people these days don't fuck with that kind of thinking because it's so authoritarian. I think a lot of young people today are really anti-authority, even more so than maybe when you grew up in anarchist spaces or whatever.
Well, if that is true, then maybe there is hope for the future. We can leave it on that positive note.
Thanks for having me, Tosh.
Go to the main library in Civic Center, get Heartbeat of Struggle. And you can read more of Andrew's writing at Truthout and the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project. And for more episodes of Sad Francisco, go to patreon.com/sadfrancisco. See you next time.